Good morning. This week's update I'm going to call information overload. As you know, most weeks we talk here about the various convergence of the signs, and it's just one of those weeks again where when I initially sat down to look at things, it appeared that there wasn't going to be a lot to talk about, or that I would be able to confine it to a very short presentation. But that didn't turn out to be the case once I got into it. So I'm going to talk today about the economy, Israel, Syria, and the Supreme Court, because I think those are all kind of relevant issues. This is just kind of an interesting thing. These are taxi cabs in England that are protesting the fact that Uber is undercutting them in prices. So if you want to continue to pay high taxi cab fares, be sure to support these taxi cab drivers. It's just an indicator of one of the shifts that we see going on in our economy. That the world is, in a sense, as some people say, this is from a graphic from the current cover of the Foreign Affairs magazine, the world is flat, or the world is deflated. But I want to put into context a little bit of what I'm going to talk about with the economy. First, by reading some passages from Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 13 and chapter 14. So Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, and I beheld another beast. Now this is talking about the false prophet. And there's a lot of speculation as to, is the false prophet loose in the earth right now? He's really not identified until Revelation chapter 13. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Verse 14. And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So here's this great, appears to be a world religious leader, will rise up, and he will cause people to worship the beast. And we've speculated a little bit in here about the fact that what is behind this religion of the false prophet. And I've suggested to you that it might be the leftism that's running rampant in the world. It's having a major impact on our world, our culture, the Supreme Court, and our current election. It is as powerful as any religion on the planet. People believe it, even though the evidence is that it doesn't work. But somebody will come and make a push because it's all about control, and that's what the Antichrist and his right-hand man, the false prophet, will be about. Over in verse 16 of Revelation chapter 13, it says, and he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save that he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And what's interesting in our world and culture now is the technology exists to make this a very simple transaction. We all use credit cards. A lot of us never use cash. Cash is frowned upon. In fact, it's becoming increasingly verboten among governments of the world. I'll explain that in a moment. But if you take that mark, there are severe consequences. In Revelation chapter 14, it says, and the third angel followed, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receiveth the mark of his name. And now, in the context of the world today, In Foreign Affairs this month, their title is "The World is Flat, Surviving Slow Growth." The world is in a major economic slowdown. It's soon to rival what's going on in what happened back in 2008. Now, I went to an interesting presentation this week about what's going on in the economy here in Central Ohio. Interesting fact is that we have had, I forget the time period that they used, I think since the last recession we've had 15% job growth, 15.7%. The top in the country is Austin, Texas, which is about 17.2%. So we're pretty close to Austin. We're in the top 10 in the country. And another interesting statistic, if you look at all the counties in the United States, who has returned to the same employment level as they had back at the time of the recession in 2008. And out of all the counties in the United States, only about 200 counties have recovered to that extent. All of them, interestingly enough, are in the middle of the country. And 7 of those counties are Franklin and the counties surrounding Columbus. So the economy here is pretty good. We live in a bit of a bubble. In fact, we're the furthest east of any of the counties that have recovered. So it was an interesting statistic. But the central bankers of the world have been trying to get the economies going. They've been dropping interest rates. They've done quantitative easing ad infinitum. They've poured trillions and trillions of dollars out there, and it's just not working. Here's a brief interview with David Stockman. You might remember him from, he was President Reagan's budget director. He's not an optimist on the economy, but here's what he has to say, his view about what's going on with oil prices, and the recovery, or lack thereof.
This was a dead cat bounce, and they've already buried the cat. And I want to weigh in on the oil discussion you've just been having.
Sure.
Because, frankly, I think your traders are smoking something stronger than I can legally buy here in Colorado, where I am at the moment.
I mean,
the oil
I cannot
price
confirm or deny that. But.
The oil price is heading into the teens because the world economy is falling apart. We're done with a 20-year credit bubble. The central banks everywhere are lost, out of dry powder. Look at the data coming in year to date, and this is why I think the stock market is going down too. But every bellwether economy, exports in Japan down 13% last night in January. China down 10.5%. India down 13.5%. Korea down 18.5%. Everywhere, trade is drying up. Shipping rates are at all-time lows. Singapore is essentially crashing, and that means there is a recession that's going to engulf the entire world economy, including the United States.
But David, let me ask you this. I don't dispute the data that you're citing, and I don't dispute the fact that some of it looks pretty ugly. I also don't dispute the fact, as I mentioned when I brought you on, that we've had a very volatile start to the 2016 trading year as a result of all of these issues. But if the market is interpreting the Fed's approach to ease back a little bit and continue to be dovish, doesn't that mean we're going to see what we've seen for the last few years, which is a market that moves higher, regardless of what the data says?
No, I think this time is different, if I can use that phrase, because this time we're looking into the jaws of a recession. It will become more and more evident by the week and month, and the boys and girls in the market are going to panic when they face recession and the Fed can't do anything because it's at the zero bound already, and its balance sheet is already hideously bloated.
Well, that's optimistic, isn't it? But this is the reality of the world that we live in. For example, one of the things, this was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal the other day, China gluts swamps hinterland. So in China, where they had all of these manufacturing plants, they're empty. They're gone. They're not doing anything anymore. And China has built these massive cities that don't have people in them because they hope to bring all the people in and conduct a massive urbanization, an urbanization unlike anything that the world has ever seen. Now all the people are invested their money in these empty cities, and they're losing their savings. That's why they're fleeing. And I think I used the example last week of some you wouldn't even call them fixer-uppers in Vancouver, British Columbia, that are selling in the millions of dollars because the Chinese are doing anything they can to get their money out of that economy. And this is something that's unprecedented. Some of you remember, I've played some interviews in the past of Kyle Bass. He lives down in Texas. I must confess, I thought he was related to the oil Bass family, but he's not. He grew up in a fairly middle-class home, went to Dallas, and he's very conservative with his money. He manages a $1 billion+ hedge fund, and he has made some predictions in the past that haven't come true yet, but I think they ultimately will, like Japan is on life support, and we've seen Japan, they've gone to negative interest rates. He had some opinions about China that he related to the Financial Times recently, and this was on their editorial page, I think, yesterday. I've been to Beijing twice. I don't care to go back, Kyle Bass says. And Kyle, he has a very interesting speaking style. He's said things in the past such as, well, you know, the economy of Europe is ugly, and you don't get to blame the mirror if you're ugly, okay? Capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. I think he's quoting somebody else there, but he says this: I've been to Beijing twice. I don't care to go back. I'm okay with that. The subprime shooting, sniper rifle shooting, spearfishing hedge fund manager from Dallas, Texas, does not fear the ire of Chinese authorities. He has a decade-long record of putting his mouth where his money is, and if his latest apocalyptic call that the communist government does not have the resources to prevent a banking crisis and a vicious currency devaluation puts him at the center of the angriest debate in the financial markets, well, that is just fine by him. Anyone who is invested in China, whether you are a pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund or a large U.S. or European institution, you better be thinking about this and not with the reverence that people give to China. Everyone has this embedded belief that China can pull off the triple Lindy every time they want to do it, but our view is that they're going to have a reset. What we are witnessing is the resetting of the largest macro imbalance the world has ever seen. Banking system losses could be 4 times as big as those on the subprime mortgages in the U.S. during the financial crisis, and the central bank does not have the reserves to plug the hole and defend its currencies. China's back is completely up against the wall today, and the country is on the precipice of a large devaluation. Now, one of the things that we're going to see as a result of all this, I think, is, and I don't know how long this will take, this was an editorial the other day in the Wall Street Journal, which is hardly something that's not wanting the economy to succeed, the financial markets to do well, and sometimes even supportive of what central bankers do. But what they have is this editorial called The Political War on Cash. Listen to some of the quotes from this article and put them into the context of a coming economic system where you can only buy or sell if you have some kind of mark, whatever that's going to be. I don't know exactly what that's going to be. A lot of speculation about that. But listen to this. These are strange monetary times with negative interest rates, and central bankers deemed to be masters of the universe. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that politicians and central bankers are now waging a war on cash. That's right. Policymakers in Europe and the U.S. want to make it harder for the hoi polloi to hold actual currency. Mario Draghi from the European Central Bank, I believe, fired the latest salvo on Monday when he said the European Central Bank would like to ban 500 euro notes. A day later, economist and Democratic Party favorite Larry Summers declared that it's time to kill the $100 bill, which would mean goodbye to Ben Franklin. Alexander Hamilton may soon and shamefully be replaced in the $10 bill, but at least the 10 spots would exist for a while longer. Old Ben would be banished from the currency the way dead white males like him are banned from the history books. Limits on cash transactions have been spreading in Europe since the 2008 financial panic, ostensibly to crack down on crime and tax avoidance. Italy has made it illegal to pay cash for anything worth more than 1,000 euros, that's $1,116, while France cut its limit to 1,000 euros from 3,000 euros last year. British merchants accepting more than 15,000 euros in cash per transaction must first register with the tax authorities. Fine for violators can run into the thousands of dollars. Deutsche Bank CEO John Cryan predicted last month that cash won't survive another decade. The enemies of cash claim that only crooks and cranks need large denomination bills. They want large transactions to be made electronically so the government can follow them. And this was reported in the Financial Times about a month ago. The benefits of scrapping cash, an editorial on their comments page, related to what John Cryan had said at the Davos World Economic Forum last month. And here's John Cryan. Here's exactly what he had to say.
On the question of whether cash will exist in future, I think we do actually spend quite a bit of time on that. And whether, because cash I think in 10 years' time probably won't. There's no need for it. It's terribly inefficient and expensive. But if you think about money, and there is actually a lexicon today, so I'm not plagiarizing it. If you think, there are really three functions of cash.
Feel free to read out the FT to the audience.
There are three functions of cash. And if you look at the blockchain technology itself is quite interesting. Bitcoin I don't think is. Blockchain I'm much more interested in, we come later. I'm much more interested in data than I am in process. I think where we're really struggling is with data, and the rules around data and the new regulations on data and the obligations on banks to report on data, much more so than process. But if you look at blockchain technology, I think it can be used for digital identity purposes, if that's acceptable to the G20, because this is going to be a supranational initiative, and the US is going to have to take a leading role in this. Okay. And there are better stores of value. There are better stores of value sometimes than cash.
Yes.
And it's interesting whether if oil price has fallen, has the dollar just gone up, or has oil fallen? Yeah. And everything's relative. The other measure, the other aspect of cash that's important is a unit of measure. And we account in cash terms. We express our accounts in dollars or euros or however we account. And I don't think there's much threat there because it's just convenient. It's decimal. It's easy to use. But we do worry about cash because I think that should be dematerialized. I think the world has enough robust technology, and I think governments would be interested in that because it's the old adage that the money launderer's greatest friend is the 500 euro note because it's anonymous and it's a relatively large denomination. It'd be better if everything were traceable.
I think there are 5.
This is the CEO of PayPal, electronic transaction firm, and he just has a few comments that I'll play here.
Key trends, in my view, that are going on right now that I think we all need to keep in mind. First of all, money is absolutely digitizing in front of us right now. Checks are disappearing. Cash, we talked about, all over the world, money is digitizing. However, let's not forget, 85% of the world's transactions are still in cash right now. So we've got a long way to go on that, but it is just inexorable. It is going to happen. Money is digitizing and will continue to do so going forward.
Yeah, so that's the trend. And one of the reasons they want to do that is control. Because if you carry around a $100 bill, you must be a drug dealer or you must be doing something to avoid taxes. They never look at the fact that maybe taxes are so high. That's why people are trying to do things in cash to avoid that. And of course, what do we have is we have one presidential candidate on one side of the ledger who says that we should have even higher tax rates. Take 99% of somebody if they're above a certain limit. And I always want to say is you first, right? You can voluntarily write a check to the government. If you don't think people are paying enough, go ahead and stop being a hypocrite about it. So there's this threat to the future of the 100 bill. The Financial Times commentary continued. Why? It's partly down due to why is cash being taken away? Why? It's partly down to consumer habit coupled with the popular mistrust of banks. The other factor, though, is the behavior of central banks themselves. One unintended consequence of super loose monetary policy is that it has reduced incentives for consumers to store their money in banks, like Negative interest rates. Why should you pay the privilege of parking your cash someplace? By all means, people should be able to go cashless if they like, but it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the politicians want to bar cash as one more infringement on economic liberty. They may go after the big bills now, but does anyone think they'd stop there? Why wouldn't they eventually ban all cash transactions, much as they ban gold and silver as mediums of exchange? Beware politicians trying to limit the ways you can conduct private economic business. It never turns out well. And the Wall Street Journal article concludes, so long, Ben Franklin, politicians want to coerce you to spend. So that's a little bit of an economic update. I could go on literally, folks, for the stuff that I'm seeing out there about the economy and what's going on and the things that are unprecedented and converging and accelerating. And so while this panel at Davos talked about it might take 10 years to get rid of cash, I don't think it will take that long if there's a concerted effort to do that, because everything we see is accelerating right now. What's the answer? I think if everybody resisted this thing on cash, they would have problems with it, but I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I know that there's an economic system coming at some point where you will need a mark to buy or sell. That's what the Bible says. I believe the Bible. I trust the Bible. I don't trust politicians and central bankers. They're going to act in their own interest. The PayPal guy and other comments he made on that panel said that essentially the materials to build a smartphone cost $30. He said everybody in the world is going to have a smartphone. And that's going to be one of the digital, at least the first digital medium for economic transactions. Now, I want to make a few comments about Justice Scalia. I talked a little bit about this last week. There have always been Supreme Court justices stay until they're old people ready to die. And sometimes they die in office. Now, we've had, 4 presidents. I don't know how many of them died in office. I'm going to guess 8 or 9, probably. I know 4 were assassinated. There have been 49 Supreme Court justices. Now, of course, there's 9 people in the Supreme Court currently, but 49 of them have died in office. So the fact that Scalia died in office is not that unusual. And I don't want to get into all the conspiracy theories running around that it was a hit or whatever. I just know this. 79-year-old people die suddenly. He was not in the best of health. He was supposed to have rotator cuff surgery, according to some reports I read from his doctor, but his doctor did not believe that he was strong enough to have that kind of surgery. And having had rotator cuff surgery, it is the toughest surgery I've ever personally had. It's a tough thing. And so we saw these things with the Supreme Court justices lined up there at the Capitol. He was taken up the steps of the Capitol and he laid in state. There was a big funeral yesterday. He was a Roman Catholic. His son, who's a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, they gave the homily and participated in the service. And so there was a lot of this ceremony. Now, it was unusual that one of the things that happened was President and Mrs. Obama did show up, but they didn't go to the funeral. And from my understanding is it's the first time a president has not gone to the funeral of a Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States. So that's his choice. You can draw your own conclusions from that. Ramirez, I think, had a great editorial about the effect, the picture, the head bowed on the Statue of Liberty and the flame kind of out and not smoking, because this is going to be a major political fight. My personal opinion is that Obama, well, it's not my opinion, it's a fact. Obama has the right to appoint somebody. He has a right to appoint anybody that he wants. And the Senate has a right not to vote on it or to vote that person down. that is also a constitutional fact. So we have a political battle on our hands because the court is divided. Most decisions now are 5-4. They are ideologically driven between people who are originalist in their understanding of the Constitution and people who think judges should engage in social justice and just change the law on the whim because they feel like it. We saw that last year with the same-sex marriage decision. There was no legal justification for that whatsoever, other than Anthony Kennedy felt that it should be done. And he was joined by 4 of the justices of the Supreme Court. Where it becomes important, for example, this noted from Investors Business Daily, through the first 5 years of his presidency, Barack Obama added 11,327 pages to the Code of Federal Regulations. No one knows how many criminal laws are contained in the compendium of legal rules and regulations promulgated by executive departments and administrative actions. Now look, folks, this is a major issue. So, for example, what happened recently, for example, this is also noted in Investors Business Daily, his rewriting, that's Obama's rewriting of the immigration laws by executive order, stayed by the courts, his reordering of the energy economy by regulations, stayed by the courts, his enacting the nuclear deal with Iran, the most important treaty of this generation without the required 2/3 of the Senate, by declaring it an executive agreement. And the New York Times itself noted that this is a very important thing. The article they had yesterday, or a couple days ago, said this: there is a reason Republican senators are so adamant in their refusal to let President Obama appoint a successor to Justice Antonin Scalia, a towering figure in conservative jurisprudence. And I might add, in my estimation, the leading conservative Supreme Court jurist of all time, and certainly the best writer the court has ever had. An Obama appointment would be the most consequential ideological shift on the court since 1991, creating a liberal majority that would almost certainly reshape American law and American life. I agree 100% with that. So put it down. February 21st, John Haller agrees with the New York Times. They cite this law professor at Washington University in St. Louis. At-risk precedents run from campaign finance to commerce, from race to religion, and they include some signature Scalia projects such as the Second Amendment, said Lee Epstein, a law professor in political science at Washington University in St. Louis. Some would go quickly, like Citizens United, that's campaign finance, and some would go slower, but they'll go. And that's exactly correct, I believe, that they will go eventually. For example, the week before, a few days before he died, there was a vote on the Supreme Court. It was a very unusual vote. Lower court was hearing issue about the regulations to essentially shut down coal-burning fire plants, which will have a major economic impact on Ohio. And, of course, Obama enacted these without any regard for the consequences of this. Because as long as he's got his big plane and power to the White House, what does he care, really? Because he has an agenda. He has a leftist agenda. His leftist agenda is not constrained in any sense or fashion by the Supreme Court. It is totally ideologically driven. So the Supreme Court, in a very unusual vote, 5-4, put a stay on the enactment or the enforcement of those regulations that the Obama administration had drafted. Now let's say that did not come up to the Supreme Court until this coming week. What would happen? They're being challenged in court, but the court may or may not stay the enforcement of those regulations pending a review. So if somebody goes to the Supreme Court like they did in this case, and the vote now is 4-4. What happens? The regulations, the enforcement of those regulations are not stayed. So this is what's going to happen in case after case after case. And mark my words, some liberal judge someplace is going to do something to strike down the Second Amendment or something like that, regardless of Supreme Court precedents, and people will run up to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court will vote 4-4. And what do we have? Well, wherever that court order is enforced, that's gone. It is a, in my view, it is a constitutional crisis of the first magnitude. My view is that Obama is likely to appoint Loretta Lynch. Now, I will tell you that any opposition to her will guarantee a certain community will vote 99% or more for Hillary Clinton. And it will be used as a political weapon. And that's the consequences. You either approve her or you lose the presidency. And I think the election is, I'm not an optimist about the election in the fall. We need to be realistic about this. So the longest the Supreme Court vacancy has ever existed was about 849 days. I forget when that was exactly. It was kind of a political fight at that time. Used to be these things were approved or voted on within 2 weeks. This thing won't be voted on for about 6 months probably. But it will be, it's being timed to make the decision come just before the election to guarantee the election of Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders to the presidency. You need to understand the importance of this election. This is I cannot remember his name. He was on Jan Markell's show yesterday. He will be on this weekend. He had a video out a couple years ago called Grinding America Down. He's updated that. It's a fantastic piece of work. I think you should all get it and watch it. But here's a little video that he made prior to his endorsement of a candidate. I'm not going to play the candidate that he endorsed, that part. He endorsed Ted Cruz, by the way. But look at what his statistics are as to where this is going and why the 2016 election is important.
In 1980, there were approximately 40% of Americans that were conservative, 10% liberal, and 50% undecided. And since even our numbers show that they are capturing 85% of our young people each year through the educational system, this is how it plays out. In 2012, America was divided at 30% conservative and 30% liberal, with 40% undecided. By 2028, it will be 20% conservative, 50% liberal, and 30% undecided. And by 2036, only 20 years from now, it will be 10% conservative, 70% liberal, and 20% undecided. This is simply demographics, and there is no quick fix to change this. 2016 is the last election in my lifetime where it will even be possible to get an actual conservative elected.
Well, and I agree with that. It is a huge problem. And I'm not sure why that's still playing. But, so you should listen to Jan's show from yesterday, Understanding the Times, olivereviews.org, and also next weekend when this gentleman will be on, and I apologize for not remembering his name. Curtis Bowers? Oh, it was, okay. I don't watch that, so I'm looking at the next one. So, okay, Curtis Bowers, excellent work, but look, his point is that this is the educational system that we have, that we've created, that we've allowed to exist, and this is a major problem. And I think a statistic that, we send kids off to college, and within a year, 85% of them are spouting left-wing views. We've lost the educational system. My suggestion is you ought not just homeschool grade school, middle school, and high school. Maybe you need to grade a homeschool for college now. Because there are some good conservative institutions out there still, but by and large, they've been co-opted ideologically. I was looking at some of the regulations that the Department of Justice put out in 2011 about the use of sexist terms and trigger warnings and that type of thing. And professors that have been highly rated professors teaching for 20 years have been being fired because they had the audacity maybe to do something to suggest that maybe men and women are different. And this is the world that we live in. So this is, if I was doing this in a college, I would have to give a trigger warning. You know, you might be offended by this. But I thought that this, that somebody sent me or posted on Facebook the other day was pretty good. Jewish extremists, they want to pray on the Temple Mount. Christian extremists, they don't want to bake a same-sex wedding cake. Muslim extremists decapitate people that they don't like. Leftist extremists can't see the difference and decide to side with the decapitators. And that's true. So we have this problem. We also have this thing with Apple. Apple wants to, is fighting. They said that the guy who did the San Bernardino shooting, they can't get into his cell phone to see if there's anything else there, his iPhone. Apple's saying, we're not going to unlock it for you. Personally, I think it's great marketing for Apple. They're like, hey, the best hackers in the world, they can't get into the iPhone. So buy an iPhone if you want your data to be secure. And in fact, the Department of Justice went to court and made that argument. Hey, they're just doing this for marketing. They don't really care. They just want to make more money. Well, that's part of the reason that they exist. So it's hard. And you have 10 opportunities to enter the code into an iPhone. And if not, then it just wipes out all the data. So the FBI is stuck because they can't do, as long as you make sure that your 10 yeses are the right 10, and the guy didn't use 0000 for his entry code, it's a problem. But you know, this is a big battle between government and technology and that type of thing. And the government obviously is siding on, they want access to this information. And I have mixed emotions about it because I don't want other people to be killed, like in San Bernardino. I also want to protect my privacy. But I will just note for the record, if you're worried about somebody else finding out what you're doing, God knows everything that you're doing. So you need to think about that, too. Let's talk a little bit about Israel and the Middle East. This is Netanyahu was there, said that he wants to build a security fence around the entire state of Israel. Yesterday, an American citizen who made Aliyah to Israel, or a couple days ago, was stabbed in the West Bank in a supermarket. He was killed. He was 21. Here's a picture of him and his wife and little child. And he was laid to rest either yesterday or this morning in Jerusalem. Young soldier. Interesting enough, Janusz Bin Gao also passed away this week. Now, you may not know who he was. He was 79. He was an Israeli hero. He was born in Europe. When he was 3 or 4 years old, they fled the Nazi persecution. At some point, he and his a little bit older sibling, I think it was a sister, were separated from their parents, and they never saw their parents again. And so here was this little girl and boy, or these two siblings, about 4 years old and 6 years old, walking through Germany and Poland alone. He remembers at one time he had a piece of bread, and an adult came up and took it away from him. He hadn't eaten anything for days. It's an incredible story of his life and what he endured and the persecution that he endured. He eventually made it. He went to Pakistan. He went to Egypt. Eventually, he made it to Israel, and he became a general in the Israeli army and led one of the. And unlike a lot of other armies where the generals like Napoleon went to military school, these guys were just mainly conscripts in the army that eventually rose to the rank of general. A lot of the Israeli war heroes. And so he led an important battle in 1948 and 1967 war. And probably the most remarkable part of that war, he commanded a battalion of 100 tanks in the Golan. The Syrians had 450 tanks. and he destroyed, his group destroyed every single one of them. It's one of the most amazing military victories in history. It's miraculous, some of the things that happened during that thing. I remember seeing him in the movie about Yoni Netanyahu, Follow Me, when he went to the 35th anniversary celebration of that, the raid on Entebbe, which will have its 40th anniversary this year. He was 79. He was demonstrably an Israeli war hero. So one young, one old Israeli heroes died this week in Israel. More attacks at the Damascus Gate. It was interesting, and an envoy from the UN who works for Ban Ki-moon came to Israel, was interviewed, and said, "It's daydreaming to think Israel and the Palestinian Authority can negotiate now. There's a lot of talk now that the two-state solution is dead, but I can tell you that I believe the world will continue to push that. They will continue to mount pressure on Israel." This is also going on in Israel, the graying of the pro-Israel crowd. I don't have time to go into that, but this is part of the education system. People just don't care about Israel. Even young Jewish people don't care that much about the state of Israel. And so they're under tremendous pressure from every corner of the world right now, from every major government is pushing them to give up land. Some don't care whether they exist or not. Some want to annihilate them, like Iran. It's a major issue. This is what is prophesied, though, clearly prophesied in Scripture. This is that which was prophesied. There's no doubt in my mind that the convergence of the pressure on Israel to make peace is a prophetic happening. So I want to make another leftist, the Pope, went to the border. Now, this is stunning to me. This guy comes to Mexico. He goes to the border, down one of the major border crossings, and holds a mass and talks about how, you shouldn't be about fences and walls and all that stuff. And he makes some comments on the plane about Donald Trump not being a Christian because he wants to build a wall. Anybody who wants to build a wall is not a Christian. There were a lot of people there. It's clear that this man is not, the Christianity, the Catholicism that he uses is merely a prop to promote his real religion, which is leftism. I had a discussion with somebody about that the other day, and I said that, and the look of horror and shock that I got back told me that probably ought not to plow that field too often with this person. And they're conservative too, by the way. So I posted this Facebook. What I posted down was, okay, you don't like the walls, then Pope, tear down your wall. Because the Vatican is around walls. The Vatican has the most restrictive immigration practices on earth. It's demonstrable. The man is a demonstrable left-wing, leftist, Marxist hypocrite. Add hypocrite to the list. This is unprecedented that a pope would intervene in American presidential politics. But you ain't seen nothing yet, as they say. Even the Washington Post said this: loser pope takes on Donald Trump, suffers massive humiliation, slinks off the Vatican. That was on one of the Washington Post blog. You think I'm harsh? I mean, I'm just shocked. And Breitbart, they had this. According to CNN, the Vatican Bank holds $8 billion in assets. The Vatican has over $1.2 billion in assets off the books. It holds countless priceless assets, of course. And if any of you have been there, you know the artwork and stuff there is just tremendous. It's priceless. You really couldn't put a value on it. And Breitbart says this: how about spreading the wealth around? Why not build bridges? Why not welcome thousands of Syrian Muslim refugees or Latin Americans seeking to enter the United States illegally into Vatican City? Thus far, the Pope's big move in favor of open immigration has been to accept 2 families into Vatican parishes. That, by the Pope's own lights, is insufficient. It's time for the wall to come down, Pope Francis. How about it, Pope Francis? Why not open this gate? Why not tear down this wall? Unless perhaps there's often an excellent reason for gates and walls. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. But look, you need to understand, talk about all the time, the deception, the fog of deception, this growing leftist religion, state control of everything. It's coming. It's what's being pushed. Also, this week in Jerusalem, there was Catholic clerics got together, and they concluded this: Catholics for Justice and Peace in the Holy Land. Israel is to blame for terrorism. This is what you're going to hear continually. Yes, this was the headline in the Jerusalem Post Friday, page 4 or 5. Catholic clerics: Israel is to blame for terrorism. Listen to this. A group of the most senior clerics in Israel, headed by the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Fuad Twal, accused Israel on Thursday of responsibility for the recent wave of Palestinian violence, saying Israeli policy has created despair and frustration among Palestinians, leading them to carry out acts of terrorism. Thursday's statement asserted that the current situation for Palestinians was inhumane and said that settlements, the siege of Gaza, the siege of the rest of Palestine, military checkpoints, house demolitions, and the arbitrary behavior of Israeli soldiers humiliating the Palestinians have led to 5 months of Palestinian terror attacks against Israeli civilians and security personnel. And one of the other things they said was one of the major problems was, please be seated, I don't want anybody to hold on to your chair. The reason is the Judaization of Jerusalem. These are the guys that, help elect the Pope. You want to know where the Pope is coming from? Pope is a friend of Israel? Baloney. Don't believe it for a minute. I've showed you the pictures where he goes and he celebrates a mass in Bethlehem, Nativity Square in Bethlehem, with a Joseph wearing one of the Palestinian headpieces. And people saying at that time, Jesus was the first Palestinian. So, Caroline Glick on Friday had this to say about Israel's dangerous consensus. Recently, I found myself in a chance conversation with a former head of the Mossad's Directorate of Operations. The former master spy, whom I had never met before, knew that I am a journalist. He was aware of my political views. Directing his remarks at a friend of mine, he declared that 99% of Mossad and Shin Bet officers are leftists. He then added triumphantly that according to a former commander of the Air Force, whose name he cited, 99% of the Air Force's pilots are similarly leftist. Initially, I dismissed his comments as a noxious chest beating by a man who felt like irritating a group of right-wingers. But given the source, it is impossible to simply brush off what he said. And to be clear, far more troubling than the prospect that Israel's security establishment is uniformly leftist is the notion that there is any intellectual or ideological uniformity of any kind in the ranks of our defense community. But given our defenses community's record in recent years, there is ample reason to believe that there is more than a grain of salt in the spy chief's boast. Consider Israel's handling of Gaza. According to a number of senior officers at the end of Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the IDF senior commanders convened in Tel Aviv to determine how to handle the Hamas regime going forward. In keeping with the decision to support the reconstruction of Gaza, according to the Foreign Ministry, over the past year and a half, Israel has permitted 3.4 million tons of building materials to be imported into Gaza. And yet, according to a recent report by the UN, 74% of the civilian buildings that were destroyed in Protective Edge have yet to be rebuilt. In the meantime, Hamas has replenished its missile stores and rebuilt its military infrastructure, including its subterranean attack tunnels that traverse the border into Israel. And she goes on to relate a number of other instances relying on America, and America even under Obama and even under the Bush administration acting like, look, it's the Iranians. They're not that clever. They'll never get the bomb. They'll never be able to develop these weapon systems. And she concludes with this: then there is Iran. Iran's illicit nuclear program was first exposed in 2003. At the time, it probably made sense for Israel to follow the U.S.'s lead in blocking Iran's nuclear ambitions. But then the Americans' continued stumbles in Iraq made clear from as early as 2004 that perhaps the Bush administration wouldn't be up to the challenge of blocking Iran's path to the bomb. As for Obama, despite his oft-stated claim that all options remain on the table for dealing with Iran's nuclear program, any thought that he might be serious became patently absurd after he sided with the Iranian regime during the 2009 Green Revolution that followed its falsifications of the results of the presidential elections. None of this, however, made an impression on the security brass. Led by the Mossad for more than a decade, our senior commanders insisted that Israel could trust the U.S. and Iran. Last week, Russia announced that it will sell Sukhoi Su-30 combat fighters to Iran. According to former senior Pentagon official Stephen Bryan, the sale will tip the strategic balance in the Persian Gulf in Iran's favor and, over time, give Iran an answer to Israel's air power. This is a very significant thing. Other reports I saw this week said that Iran, because they've got all this money, billions of dollars back because of the lifting of sanctions, is going to spend $14 or $15 billion modernizing its army, its armed forces. Iran's acquisition of the Su-30 is but one of a panoply of weapons deals the regime has signed with suppliers since the sanctions regime was canceled last month. These sales, together with Iran's clear path to nuclear capabilities, mean that Iran's rise to the position of regional hegemon is unimpeded. Today, Israel is facing complex, multifaceted security challenges that exist and grow in an equally complex, multifaceted diplomatic environment. That is an understatement. To develop the means of dealing with the challenges, our security establishment needs to cultivate a permissive intellectual climate among our commanders that rewards free thinking and promotes free thinkers. She's seeing there the same thing that video about the decline in conservative thinking and the impact that it's having, even in the armed forces of Israel. And Israel is really, in my view, in a very precarious state right now. Some of their weapon systems need to be seriously upgraded. The lack of a good relationship with the United States, the administration of the United States, is hampering their development efforts, especially of anti-missile weapons that they desperately need. And at the same time, Russia is transferring missiles, air defense systems, jet fighters to Iran. And those are also, some of those missiles are making, thousands and thousands of those missiles are making their way to Hezbollah. And so we're in a desperate situation. You see the dark area here is the Sea of Galilee. Up to the right is a town called Quneitra. That sits on the border, sort of in no man's land between Israel and Syria. It'd be interesting to talk to Pastor Steve as to whether he heard anything. Reports that I had out of, that I read, not that they called me, but that I read, said that people were walking around the Galilee and they heard massive explosions just across the border in Syria. There's been essentially a news blackout. It's very difficult to determine what is going on. The situation is very fluid, but I mean, literally right across the border from Israel, I don't know how else to describe it, all hell is breaking loose. There are reports that Israel bombed the road between Dara and Damascus. That's a few times now that they've intervened in that area, even though Russia is there. What's the prophetic impact of this? Everything that I have read is said that the situation that exists right now on the borders of Israel is unprecedented. It is a volatile, fluid situation. In the Golan area, there is, right up against the border of Israel, there is an Islamic State enclave. There are al-Qaeda rebel groups within that area. There are other rebel groups. You have Russian troops. You have Iranian troops. You have Hezbollah. All of this going on right across the border from Israel. It is an unprecedented situation historically. The only thing I can say about it from a prophetic standpoint is that all of the major players that most people think will be involved in, say, an Ezekiel 38 and 39 war are right there on the border of northern Israel right now. Jordan is on the verge of collapse. Lebanon, half the people in Lebanon are refugees. Half the people. 50% are refugees over the last 5 years. The strain on the limited resources of Jordan and Lebanon are tremendous. And so those governments are trying to manage an already difficult situation that grows more difficult by the day. And at the same time, immigrants continue to pour into Europe. They're being stopped in the Balkans, but that's causing a humanitarian crisis because there aren't the resources there to take care of it. It really is one of the most volatile, disruptive things I've ever seen in all the years that I've been doing this. Some of you know I've been talking about this stuff pretty much every week for 15 years now. Turkey is also involved. There was a major car bombing in Ankara. About 2.5 dozen people killed, dozens more injured. The thing, some of the headlines. Erdogan's security policy from the Financial Times needs a reality check. Over here we have Putin bombs and the West blinks. Putin's gotten away with everything. And what he's done is masterful in the way that he's come into Syria, sort of taken control of the situation, gotten Western Syria pretty much under the regime control. And, look, what did he say last July, September when he went in there? We're going to go after what? The Islamic State. They've hardly done anything with regard to the Islamic State. Because Putin sees them as kind of a buffer against Turkey. So for Turkey, there are high stakes involved. Erdogan is making all kinds of noise. Iran is really leading the forces that are taking back these areas of Syria. They're trying to extend their influence. The Syrian Kurds are now involved. It is a very, very complicated situation. In fact, the map is very interesting. The green area is the Kurds. The orange area is the Islamic State. And where the lines go through, like up there around Aleppo and Azar, those are kind of areas that are being contested. So the Kurdish area, the Kurds claim all the way down, although ISIS controls some of those areas. The Kurds are a major problem for Iran, Syria, and Turkey. They're now involved. And so the situation right now is very confusing from a U.S. policy standpoint in the sense that we support the Kurds who are fighting the Islamic State, but not too much because we don't want them to take over Iraq, and Iraq doesn't want them to overtake Iraq, and the Iranians don't want them to overtake Iraq. So we support them, sort of. We also support the rebels that are opposing the Islamic State and the Syria-Russia axis, but now they're being attacked by the Kurds. So what do we do? And the whole situation is very, very confusing. I'll close with this. In Investors Business Daily this week, Victor Davis Hanson, who is somebody you should look up and read because he is the world's premier military historian. This man understands military history, cultural, civilizational clashes that have taken place historically. Unlike any man that I've seen, he teaches at Stanford. He's associated with the Hoover Institution. And his editorial in Investors Business Daily the other day was this: it's beginning to look like Europe in '39. Listen to what he says. I'm going to read most of what he says here, and we'll conclude with this. Give me about 5 minutes. World War II broke out when Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. A once-preventable war had become inevitable, and soon become global due to three fatal decisions. Most infamously, the Western European democracies had appeased Hitler during the late 1930s in hopes he would quit gobbling up his neighbors. Now, he's writing this as sort of a warning as to, are we doing anything like this today with not so good people? Unfortunately, the Nazis considered Western appeasement as weakness to be manipulated rather than magnanimity to be reciprocated. After the bloodless annexation of Austria and dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Hitler assumed Britain and France wouldn't go to war if he went into Poland, or if they did, that they wouldn't fight seriously. Yet Western appeasement did not alone guarantee the outbreak of World War II. The Germans invaded Poland only after a guarantee from Joseph Stalin that the Soviet Union would soon join in attacking the Poles from the east. The two dictatorships could then divvy up the country. That's a very significant region, by the way. And geographic historians have talked about that for a long time, the Northern European plain. Stalin's communist Russia had foolishly gambled that by making a deal with Nazi Germany, Hitler would leave the Soviets alone. At first, Stalin hoped that Germany would turn its war machine loose only on the Western European democracies. Yet Stalin's collaboration with Hitler guaranteed Russia also would be double-crossed less than 2 years after signing an agreement with the Third Reich. Germany surprise attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Due to Stalin's collaboration, almost 30 million Russians would die on the Eastern Front over the next 4 years. 30 million people. But it was more than Western appeasement of Hitler and Soviet collaboration that made World War II inevitable. Germany still remained relatively weak in 1939. Populations, economies, and territories of its likely enemies were collectively far greater than those of the Third Reich and its allies. A third fatal decision was needed to ensure a war. We entered World War I late in April 1917, reviving the Allied effort, helping crush the German army and win the war by November 1918. But by 1919, America had rapidly disarmed and forgotten its key role in World War I. Americans had tired of Europeans and were sick of the endless horse trading that led to the post-war Versailles Treaty. By the start of the Great Depression in 1929, America was mostly unarmed and determined never to get involved in European feuding again. Most Americans complained that the huge death toll of World War I led to neither perpetual peace nor a peaceful Germany. America's isolationism and disarmament also helped prompt another global war. Had the U.S. kept its military strong after World War I, had it entered into a formal alliance with its former World War I partners, Germany never would have risked a second war against the combined strength of a fully armed Britain, France, and the U.S. And I showed you the reports last week that show that European military strength is incredibly low, maybe as low as it's ever been in recent history. Instead, Hitler assumed that the U.S. couldn't or wouldn't offer much military help to his intended European targets. Why then did a weak Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1941 believe it could take on much of the world and inspire Axis partners such as Italy and Japan to follow its suicidal lead? The answer is obvious: British and French appeasement. Soviet collaboration and American isolation together convinced Hitler and his Axis allies that the victors of World War I were more eager to grant concessions at any cost than were the defeated. The world of 2016 is eerily beginning to resemble the powder keg of 1939 Europe. Iran, China, and North Korea, along with radical Islamic terrorist groups, all have particular contempt for Western democracies. Almost daily, various aggressive nations or organizations seek provocation by shooting off intercontinental missiles, boarding American boats, sending millions of young male Middle Easterners into the West, and issuing unending threats. China is creating new artificial islands to control commercial routes to and from Asia. The European Union is largely unarmed, yet it still trusts that it can use its vaunted smart diplomacy to reason with its enemies. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin's Russia cuts deals with Iran, Syria, and most of the enemies of the West. Like Stalin before, Putin cynically assumes his triangulations will turn aggressive powers exclusively against the West. Recently, he warned of a new world war starting in the Middle East. America is slowly withdrawing from involvement abroad, using the isolationist arguments heard in the 1920s. Past interventions in the Middle East have worn on the nation. In great nations did not appreciate American sacrifices. In tough economic times, some contend defense spending should be diverted to social programs. Appeasement, collaboration, and isolationism always prove a lethal mix, past and present. America is slowly withdrawing from involvement abroad, using the isolationist arguments heard in the 1920s. Past interventions in the Middle East have worn on the nation. In great nations did not appreciate American sacrifices. In tough economic times, some contend defense spending should be diverted to social programs. Oh, I already read this. Sorry about that. Appeasement, collaboration, and isolationism always prove a lethal mix, past and present. He's exactly correct. The world really is on the verge of something. Is this going to be when everything unfolds from a prophetic standpoint? Well, there's a big difference between now and 1939, and what's that one thing? Israel's back in the land, and the world hates her. The world is opposed to her. And so I do think this is a very significant point in history. So we'll just have to watch and see how this plays out. Let's pray, and you can go. Father, thanks again for your word. Thanks for letting us know in advance the things that we should be watching for that indicate your return and setting up your kingdom. Pray that you will help us to be faithful to your word, faithful in sharing the gospel. And Lord, I just pray that if there's anyone who's never made that decision to believe in the work of Jesus Christ on the cross as sufficient and full and complete for the forgiveness of their sins, that they will not delay in making that decision. Bless us as we go this week. In Jesus' name, amen.